In this video, you will learn how to improve your writing through appropriate coordination and subordination. My first suggestion is to go back and watch the conjunctions video if you have any doubts about what coordination and subordination mean. While I am going to define them briefly here and talk about when we use each one, the conjunctions video actually lists out the different coordinating conjunctions and subordinating conjunctions, which will be really helpful when you are exploring this topic. Let's first take a look at the word coordination. When we're coordinating something, we're creating a relationship of equality. And the roots of this word help us understand that. The root orden or ord comes from the Latin and it means order or rank. The prefix co also comes from Latin and means joint, mutual, common, or equal. So if we're coordinating something, we're saying it's of equal or mutual order, equal or mutual significance. Think about the word co-captain, right? They're two captains, but they're of the same rank. It's the same thing with coordinating conjunctions. When we use coordinating conjunctions, we are sending the message that the elements we're joining are equal. Remember that when you're writing, your job is to communicate your ideas as clearly as possible to the reader. You cannot expect your reader to be able to read your mind. So you have to be really careful about the words that you're using, and coordinating conjunctions are part of that. Let's look at some ways in which coordination is appropriate. Jason remembered to brush his teeth, but he forgot to wash his face. This is the perfect use of a coordinating conjunction. I've got one clause, Jason remembered to brush his teeth, linked to another contrasting clause, and they're in parallel structure. I've got my two subjects, Jason and he, my two verbs, remembered and forgot, and then the complements of those, the infinitives to brush his teeth and to wash his face. That's exactly when you would want to use a coordinating conjunction. Here's another example. Elaine wanted ice cream and cake for dessert. So and is joining ice cream with cake. And again, that's an appropriate coordinate relationship. They're the same part of speech, the same part of the sentence. They're both direct objects. And they're really of equal importance. And they're of equal status relating back to the verb wanted. Her mother would let her have only one or the other. Or is joining one and other to show an equal and equivalent choice. So again, all of these are appropriate, correct uses of coordination. We want to show they're equal, and they really need to be equal parts. If you're going to use a coordinating conjunction, the elements that you're linking basically need to be the same. They need to be both subjects, both verbs, and the same kinds of verbs. If you're not able to make your coordinate elements parallel, that's a sign that you should not be using coordinating conjunctions. And if you're not sure what I mean by parallel, then I suggest you go back and watch the parallel structure video. That one's really important to improving your writing as well. Let's look at a slightly more complex example. This is a passage from early in the novel of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Here Steinbeck is describing the main characters, George and Lenny, before we even know who they are. And he uses a substantial amount of coordinating conjunctions to do this. If you've read the novel, you know that the coordinating conjunctions make a lot of sense here in terms of how George and Lenny, while they may not seem like equals, they are both of equal importance to the fulfillment of their dream. They have a coexisting relationship. And so it makes sense that he would use a lot of coordinated conjunctions to describe them physically. So let's take a look at what he's joining. The first and joins denim trousers and denim coats with brass buttons. These are equivalent in terms of what they mean and also in terms of the part of speech. They're both functioning as objects of the preposition. Or we could even go back further and say in denim trousers, in denim coats, those two objects of the preposition are both functioning to modify dressed. And the next and joins, they both wore black shapeless hats. Both carry tight blanket rolls slung over their shoulders. Parallel. Subject, verb, direct object. Next, we join small with quick. Two predicate adjectives. Restless eyes, sharp, strong features. Two objects of prepositions with adjectives that describe those objects. Thin with bony, two adjectives. Large pale eyes joined with wide sloping shoulders. Again, two objects of prepositions that have adjectives describing the objects. The next and is a little bit different. Notice how it follows a semicolon. So it's taking a slightly different operation here. This actually backs up and links walked his opposite with he walked. So even though the first one is inverted, where we have the verb before the subject, it's still coordinate in that the subject and verb are starting the clause, and they're really, it's actually the same verb. So it helps link those two clauses into a compound sentence. And finally, but joins swing and hung to create a contrast with verbs. So when should we not coordinate? Some people or textbooks will call it faulty coordination. I call it lazy coordination. And this is because I think we tend to overuse coordinating conjunctions. We have several ideas, several thoughts, and in our minds, one just follows the next. So we go for the easiest relationship that we can think of, and that's usually and, maybe but. Think about little kids when they're talking. How often they might say, and. They're just kind of letting it all fly out of them. And this is what we often tend to do when we're not taking our time to think carefully about how we're structuring our sentences. It's very common, and I'm sure that if you go back and look at a piece of your writing, you could see lots of examples of where you're using a coordinating conjunction when that might not be the best way to express the relationship between the elements that you've joined. So we really want to avoid lazy coordination. So let's look at some examples to see what that actually looks like. Clementine is exhausted by her workload and wants to drop class. When we hear that, probably we don't notice anything wrong with the sentence, and many people would not identify any grammatical errors. However, it is lazy coordination. It's not linking elements in the best possible way. And we can notice this if we try to put it in parallel structure. So the first thing we should notice is that the and is, what is it linking? It's linking or joining is exhausted with wants. Two verbs, okay, fine. But we shouldn't stop there. We need to look at what types of verbs we have. Is exhausted is passive voice, and wants is active voice, and those are not the same thing. Even though they're both verbs, they're very different in nature. And in fact, mismatched verbs are often a sign that you have faulty coordination. If you can't put something in parallel structure, in part because maybe the verbs are different, then they really don't belong together in a relationship of equivalence. Here's another example. Frederick Douglass struggled against the bonds of slavery for the first 2 decades of his life, and he later came to write a book about his experiences. Again, nothing sounds wrong with this. And in fact, when we come to look at the verbs, struggled, came, those really aren't that different. They're both action verbs in the active voice. So what's wrong with it? Well, if we really think about the ideas, it's not just an addition idea, which the and is suggesting. There's something more subtle going on here. Our job as a writer is to figure out what that is and to convey it clearly. So what's the answer? The answer is subordination, or sometimes creating phrases, which we're also going to lump under the idea of subordination. This allows us to create more precise relationships between the elements we're joining into one sentence. Again, let's take a look at the word and how it breaks down into roots. Ordin or ord again means order or rank. The prefix sub, however, means under or below. So the word subordination and subordinating conjunctions really means that one idea is under or below the other idea. When we use subordinating conjunctions, or we otherwise create dependent clauses or even phrases, we're emphasizing one idea over another, which allows us to create precise relationships, which is what we want if we're looking to improve our writing. So let's take a look at those other sentences that we said were inappropriately coordinated. Again, Clementine is exhausted by her workload and wants to drop a class. What is a better relationship between these ideas? She's exhausted by her workload. She wants to drop a class. Here there really seems to be a relationship of cause and effect or consequence. So we might say, because Clementine is exhausted by her workload, she wants to drop the class. Here we've created an adverb clause. So we've emphasized the fact that she wants to drop a class, and we've clearly communicated that this is because she's exhausted. Perhaps we want to do something even more subtle. So we could create a description that suggests a reason. Clementine, exhausted by her workload, wants to drop a class. So here I've turned the exhausted part into a participial phrase. It does something very similar. The idea of dropping a class is still emphasized, and the exhausted by her workload is the implied reason. It's just slightly less obvious than because. One isn't necessarily better than the other. It just depends on the context and the rhythm that fits in the paragraph that you're writing. So both of these options work better than using and. Let's look at the Frederick Douglass sentence. What is the specific relationship between these two ideas? He struggled against the bonds of slavery. He wrote a book about his experiences. An option might be to turn one of these into a description that illuminates the main idea. Frederick Douglass, who struggled against the bonds of slavery for the first 2 decades of his life, later came to write a book about his experiences. So here I've created an adjective clause. You could also do a time relationship. After struggling against the bonds of slavery for the first 2 decades of his life, Frederick Douglass wrote a book about his experiences. That would also work. It's the same idea as before. One isn't necessarily better than the other. It depends on the context in which the sentences appear and the rhythm that you're trying to achieve with the decision that you make. So how do we know, again, which should I coordinate or subordinate? Here are some steps that you could use. First, find the conjunction. The fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Then figure out what that conjunction is joining. Are these elements equal? To figure that out, you could try putting it in parallel structure. If you're using a coordinated conjunction, it really needs to be in parallel structure anyway. If it's not, or cannot be made parallel, that's a good sign that these elements should not be joined with a coordinating conjunction, and that you need to find a more precise way to show the relationship between these elements. Once you figure out what that relationship is, you revise the sentence structure to reflect that relationship. And sometimes it involves a complete rewriting, and don't be afraid to do that. If you can make it better, if you can make it clearer, then that's what you need to do. It might help to think of the relationships of the elements that you're putting in a sentence in terms of foregrounding and backgrounding. So think of a piece of artwork. What's in the foreground? The thing that's in the foreground is what our attention is drawn to first. It's usually what the artist is emphasizing. But there's also background, which adds interest and often provides meaning to help us understand the foreground. So what you're choosing to put in the main clause is the foreground, and what you're choosing to put into a phrase or a subordinate clause is the background. So let's try it. Here are 6 sentences. They all rely on coordinating conjunctions. So what you need to do is figure out what is being joined, figure out what better relationship might be. And again, I'll remind you that you might want to think about trying to put these sentences in parallel structure first. And if it doesn't work, that helps you see what's being joined. You don't have context, you just have individual sentences. So some interpretation and choices involved. When there's more than one option, I'll try to show you those. If the sentence seems appropriately coordinated, then just write a C beside it. Number 1, I went to the library and I conducted research for my assignment. The relationship here, while the verbs are work and it seems like it is mostly parallel, it's probably a relationship of a reason. Why did I go to the library? In order to conduct research for my assignment. So here's a really clean, clear, concise version. I went to the library to conduct research for my assignment. You could say, because I needed to conduct research for my assignment, I went to the library, but that's a little bit wordy. This just very clearly and succinctly conveys the idea. Number 2, many people are afraid to take risks, and this often prevents them from having meaningful experiences. Again, it probably doesn't sound wrong. And if we look at the verbs, we see that they're a little bit off. They are afraid. So I have a linking verb and a predicate adjective. And then I have an action verb. So the different verbs tell me that I have a mismatch, that this isn't going to work. So I need to figure out what that better relationship is. This looks to be some degree a causal relationship. Because many people are afraid to take risks, they prevent themselves from having meaningful experiences. Number 3, her parents not only were shocked by her behavior, but they also felt a great disappointment. Here I've actually used correlative conjunctions. And once again, if you're not sure what that means, the conjunctions video outlines that for you. When I use correlative conjunctions, you have to have parallel structure. That's not going to work here because I have were shocked, which is a passive voice verb, and then I have felt disappointment, which is a linking verb. So I need to change the relationship. You could say her parents were both shocked and disappointed by her behavior, so turn them both into passive voice. Her parents, shocked by her behavior, expressed their disappointment. So here you're taking more of a descriptive phrase and embedding that and emphasizing the idea of expressing disappointment. Number 4, Emily loves soccer, but her sister preferred softball. If we try to make this parallel, we see Emily loves soccer, so subject, verb, direct, object. Her sister preferred softball, subject, verb, direct, object. This sentence is parallel, and it is correctly coordinated. Number 5, the teacher announced an extra quiz on Friday, but she also said that next week's test will be canceled. What's the better relationship here? There's maybe a causal relationship. Actually, here first I got a time relationship. One happened a sequence, one happened then the other. After announcing an extra quiz on Friday, the teacher canceled next week's test. Or you could do a causal relationship. Because there will be an extra quiz on Friday, the teacher canceled next week's test. And 6, Elliot was a surgeon on duty that afternoon, and he saved the man who suffered a heart attack. So here, foreground, background. I probably want to emphasize the saving. So I want to background the idea that he was the surgeon by turning it into a descriptive phrase. Elliot, a surgeon on duty that afternoon, saved the man who suffered a heart attack. So now I've got the positive embedded in there, and I'm emphasizing the idea that he saved the man.